And given that the ways that women are allowed to wield power, marriage is one of the few
ways to do that. Yeah.
We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us. But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges, while the foolish build barriers.
You raise walls, I destroy them. Let's see who prevails.
Just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Allow my sword to join you in the fight against evil.
The world needs us to chase dreams.
We have to dedicate ourselves each and every single day to this fight because I can't do it alone.
You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
There will be a reckoning with Anne Leckie.
Ooh, I'm Jen.
I'm Paul.
And today, as Paul just stated, we are here with Anne Leckie, the award-winning, everything award-winning author of the Ancillary series and her first fantasy novel, The Raven Tower. Welcome to the show, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. Especially after I got to read the book, and then I was like, oh, squishy stuff! Rather one giant hard rock of stuff, if we're being specific.
Yes, we probably should put a spoiler wall up very, very, very early. As like now!
There will be spoilers in this conversation, people, so go read the book right away, and then come back to us as soon as you finish it, because things happen.
Or if you're the kind of person that spoilers don't bother you, then go on and keep listening to us, and then you can read the book after.
Exactly. All right, so Anne, I was going to ask you first to just tell us a bit about the book itself, but I think we'll start with this, which is that everybody keeps telling me that this book is inspired by Shakespeare's Hamlet, but I'm frankly too tired and usually too dense to notice such literary parallels, so is it inspired by Shakespeare's Hamlet? And if so, why use Hamlet as the basis for not just the plot, but your characters?
So it is inspired by Hamlet. There are actually 3 source texts for this book. Hamlet is one of them. Usually I don't say that up front because I think it's fun for people to notice it, but obviously people who are listening in
might be as dense as I am.
Well, no, it's not a question of dense necessarily. I think it's a question of what you're expecting to find.
That's true.
Because You're not the only one of my beta readers who's a very smart person and a very good reader did not notice it until I mentioned it. But the reason that I chose Hamlet was because I noticed, at least for myself, I was reading something else. I was reading Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. And it seemed to me that the plot of Death and the King's Horseman kind of fit into the plot of Hamlet. Now, whether that's deliberate on Wole Soyinka's part, or if it's something that is entirely existing in my fevered imagination, I have no idea. But it looked really interesting to me. And so I started kind of playing with that thought. And that's part of why the characters are coming from Hamlet as well, is because that was really where the idea began for the story. But there were some things I just couldn't bring myself to do. Like, I really was not gonna... Ophelia gets treated really badly in Hamlet. I mean, by the author. Like, obviously, Hamlet is a class A jerk, and treats her horribly. But her character's not treated well. Gertrude gets treated really badly, by the author in Hamlet. The women don't get a lot of, respect in that play. And so I was going to treat them differently. So I took the cast of characters and decided I was going to take who I wanted and do whatever I wanted with the people who I was using.
Which makes sense. What are the other source texts? I heard 2.
You heard 2. So the third one actually is one that I can't pronounce because it's in Swedish. I'm going to say Grotesanger, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong. But it's a relative of the story about how the sea became salt. That there's a magical millstone that you can, as long as you're grinding it, will grind out whatever you ask it for.
Ah.
Oh, it suddenly dawned. So there's a bunch of versions of that story, but the one that I was really thinking mostly about was one where two slave girls who are giants are being forced to continually grind out things for a particular king until finally they say, there are ships on the way and we're done milling, and the millstone cracks into pieces and the ships come and kill everybody. And I thought that was really kind of cool and interesting, and I sort of fitted onto my Hamlet plot, and I really enjoyed the results of that.
Well, that sort of answers my next question.
Which was where the narrator came from.
Exactly. What on earth made you decide to have a rock? But now I guess we know, sort of.
That's exactly what made me decide to have a rock. I was thinking of that giant millstone.
Right. That's amazing. That's the way that your brain works, Anne. That's all I have to say.
But then I had to go backwards from there and give the stone a history, right? That was a lot of fun.
I can imagine, because rocks definitely go through quite a bit in the overall evolution of a planet, I suppose one could say.
They do. They go through a lot. In fact, they change a lot. In this world, there aren't very many rocks still existing that are as old as the narrator, which caused me problems. I like to try and get my biology and geology and stuff right for my fantasy, and my geology's so bad with the narrator. I hope no geologist will come and point a finger at me and say, Anne, that's not how that works. So
we're going to have to ask one of our co-hosts, which was Alex Axe, who is in fact a geologist.
Yeah, Alex might have things to say about my geology.
Alex might have things to say. I wouldn't notice, though, so that's really all that matters. The non-geologists out here are like, oh, no, that makes sense. Strength and patience just holds himself together, or themselves together, I should say.
That's right. Well, ultimately, that was what I decided, which was my rock is a god with essentially magic powers. So maybe it just didn't wear like that kind of rock ought to.
Right. I mean, considering that one of your other gods is a mosquito.
Mm-hmm. A swarm of mosquitoes.
And they don't live particularly long time either. So, but, a god could do it, I imagine.
Yeah.
So this is not so much a geology question, but it's a more general world building question. So when I first started reading this, it felt a lot like Earth, because you talk about a lot of the processes we find on Earth. You talk about trilobites. You talk about all sorts of things that make it feel like it's a XP of Earth, but it's not Earth. But I wanted to ask you about how you developed this world geographically, culturally, technologically, because it feels kind of like Homeric Greece era world in a not quite, if you look at the map, kind of like a sideways version of Byzantium. So I was just curious as to what your inspirations from those axes were.
So this particular universe, I've written a fair amount of short fiction in this universe, actually, before the novel. And it is very definitely modeled on Earth. It's Earth if gods existed. Although I've taken some geographical liberties. Once again, I think my tides don't work the way they should either on this channel where the two cities are. But I've taken some geographical liberties, but for the most part, I have used geography that's very close to existing Earth geography, but I have changed the history somewhat. Obviously, at least it seems to me, if you could have unambiguously obvious gods walking around, history would have been actually very different from what it is. And so I figure I can do whatever I want historically. But astronomically, in terms of climate, in terms of geography, in terms of the way the world works and animals work, it's definitely Earth.
Well, that helps sort of take a placement with this. It was funny, though, because before we started, Paul and I were discussing the map going, wait a minute, that is sideways from where I thought it would be. How did that work? And yet, at the same time, it made perfect sense once we realized what we were looking at.
Yeah, well, and so the location in the story, partly the map in the book, which is really beautiful, is drawn from a quickie horrible scribble that I gave to the map drawer, who then turned it into this beautiful thing. And of course, I'm not a cartographer, and my geography isn't great, but the spot that I was imitating, which once again, I didn't manage to imitate how it does tides and all this stuff. I've actually never visited this place, is in Scandinavia.
Ah.
Oh, I was thinking Black Sea Aegean, not Northern Europe. Oh.
Yeah, right? Because see, once again, I'm doing Hamlet. Where does Hamlet take place?
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense in context.
Yeah, now our brains are going, oh, that makes sense.
Ah!
So that was what I did. I grabbed that location and just took whatever I wanted out of that location. Now, I don't think the directions are quite exactly right, but in fact, Elsinore, it's a place that really exists. It's in an access into the Black Sea, and it's there because that's one of the couple of navigable places to get between the ocean and the sea. And there's a fortress on either side of that. In fact, there's two towns. There's a city called Helsingor on one side in Denmark, and a city called Helsingor on the other side in Sweden.
Well, that's going on my bucket list.
Right? Well, it was on my list too, and I never made it there the last time. I was like, ooh, next time I'm in Europe, I'll go visit, and I never did.
Oh, someday, right? So I'm going to kind of go back to strength and patience again, because, and this isn't just about necessarily strength and patience, but it is woven through a lot of the aspects of your world building and the two towns and how your society functions, things like that. And it brings us back to the ancillary series, and that is that you apparently are obsessed with bureaucracy.
I never would have said that about myself, but okay.
It's everywhere. You have red tape, you have rules, these very, and a lot of that is because you have decided in both the ancillary series and in Raven Tower to really kind of sift through language with a fine-tooth comb. And in the Raven Tower more specifically, or maybe more generally, you are playing with the concept that words have power, and speaking truth has power, and speaking lies has power, and they all affect how this world functions. Like obviously the gods specifically, but it also has to do with how the Raven's lease functions and that sort of governmental structure and everything like that. So talk to us a little bit about why that plays such a big role in the Raven Tower.
Honestly, I'm not, in terms of language, some of it is because language is just sort of inherently fascinating. At least I find it so. We think of it as terribly abstract, like, when you're a kid and somebody's mean to you and the grown-ups who don't actually want to help you say, well, just say sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Like, oh, it's just words. But words are extraordinarily powerful, not just in terms of, you say something really hurtful to somebody and it really does genuinely hurt them. But when you think about statements like, I now pronounce you spouses, right? I now pronounce you man and wife. I now pronounce you groom and groom, or whatever. So that's a thing where there was a state before, and then you say the words, and the legal state of those folks have changed, or you're under arrest, right? It's amazing to me just how many things you can change just by saying, right? And so that was a thing that sort of fascinated me just because language is interesting. And I don't know, as I would have put it, words interest me and language interests me. I suspect that becomes a matter of bureaucracy, partly for those reasons, that a lot of the ways that words become sort of semi-magically powerful has to do with law and custom. So that if someone can say, now you are a knight, you are Sir So-and-so, the sort of magic of that utterance comes from a whole legal background, right? And so I found that really very interesting. The genesis of this particular fantasy universe came about when I was reading about ancient Roman pagan religion, which in a lot of ways was very legalistic, was very much, I promise you this, and then I will, in return for this particular service, if you're, you would name the god very specifically, you would say specifically what you were giving in return for a specific service, and you would give specifically word for word what you said you would if you got that thing from the god. There would be ceremonies where the form was that if the person at the head of the procession down the street saw a dog, they had to turn around and start over again because the procession was now impure. Very legalistic. Well, what they would do, right, would be to put blinders on the person at the head of the procession so that if there was a dog running down the street, they wouldn't see it.
That's
right.
That's hilarious.
Transactional and formal and very, very legal and very strange. And you can see why Rome just figured like they can put any god they wanted into this weird framework. They put Greek gods. Let's take some Egyptian gods. Oh, here's Cybele. Let's take her. Oh, here's a Gaulish god. We'll take them too. It's like, yeah, it's like.
Oh yeah, they took anybody. In fact, I think that was common for with older polytheistic systems. It was really easy to import other gods in, but of course the Romans, as you say, they did it with abandon.
Yes.
But I was really intrigued by that idea of being very legalistic, and that eventually grew into the idea of gods who could only speak the truth, and the various ways you could sort of wiggle around that. If you were in that position, how could you lie while telling the literal truth? What could you do if you couldn't actually lie? What kinds of power do you have if you're a being who isn't very powerful, but at least you can lie? All of those things really kind of interested me. And I guess ultimately they come down to red tape because so many of those things rest in custom and law. And also because I think I was interested in sort of older cultures, older civilizations. And sometimes we think of those older civilizations as being very primitive, but in fact they weren't. They were far more sophisticated than most people stop and think. Writing was invented to keep track of receipts for handing things out and keeping inventories and knowing how much money was on hand, how much grain we had on hand, how many people there were to feed. They're doing really complicated bureaucratic things very, very early in human history. And so that kind of intrigued me, that sort of bit of ancient life that we often forget, which is how administration heavy large populations have always had to be.
That suddenly makes perfect sense. And now I'm thinking about be careful what you wish for, because clearly that is a very good warning in the world of the Raven Tower.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we were talking about language, so let's go actually to the text of the book. You are well known, especially from the Ancillary series, for doing inventive and interesting things with language. And in this novel, we have a second-person point of view as our primary point of view to our protagonist, air quotes, and then a third-person point of view for Strength and Patience of the Hill. So I was curious as to what prompted you to tell the story in that way, and what do you think the advantages were to tell the story as in talking to the erstwhile quasi-protagonist, because as Jen and I have discussed, Iolo
isn't really the protagonist, is he?
Yes, he's not Iolo. He's not really a protagonist. He's the main character, but he's a main character, but not a protagonist.
He's a very, very major character, but yes, he's not the protagonist. So I'll be 100% straight with you. I read and loved, as so many people did, N.K. Jemison's 5th season.
Yes!
And I said, I want to play with that toy too. And so I thought about it and I said, can I use this toy on this story? And it felt right. So later, sort of recently, I've seen people point out the advantages that it gave me. It gave me a number of advantages. It allowed me to have a narrator who could talk about themselves while concealing huge amounts about themselves. It had some disadvantages. I wasn't able to get Iolo or any character besides Strength and Patience. I couldn't get any of their interiority onto the page, so I could only show their sort of outer features. But, I feel like it kind of worked out as it is. But mostly I just kind of wanted to see if I could do it.
Typical Anne.
Yeah, I think you did. It was a surprise. I mean,
yes.
I had managed to not read reviews till I read your book, so it came as a surprise, like, oh, well, this is different. And yes, my first thought was, oh, this is like N.K. Jemisin. Okay, we'll go with this.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Nora's awesome, right? I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
Nora's fabulous. But she is one of the most prominent folks to recently use second person, at least in a longer piece. I think it's actually, second person is not uncommon in short fiction. It's a lot less common in longer fiction. And it just seemed like it would be fun to play with.
It certainly was fun to read. And I can understand why some people have bounced off of that narration, but at the same time, it led us to that ending.
Yeah.
In which my jaw dropped and I basically just screamed, "What have you done to me, Anne?"
I don't know. What did I do?
You made me rethink everything, because that's really the moment that you realize that Aolo is not the protagonist and never has been the protagonist. And though I was talking to Paul right before the podcast, and I said it was a bit like, to me, it felt a bit like The Sixth Sense, in that the twist is something that you should have seen coming the entire time, and yet you are so tricked by the narrative that it just seems like magic all of a sudden. What really led to you, because obviously you're using that narrative to lead to that trick. So was that your intention through the entire book, to have never have had Aolo as the protagonist, or was it something that developed over the course of using those narrative techniques?
So that's difficult to answer, partly because of the way that I work, but I think I knew all along where I was headed. And in fact, unusually for me, I knew that last line very early in the composition process. Very often I'll know how the story ends, but I don't know the words of the ending. In this case, I knew what the last line of the novel was just super early. So I knew that's what I was building toward. I did not think of it in terms of who was the main character and who wasn't. I just thought of it in terms of who needed to be the focus. And I knew it would be Aolo, and it would be the narrator, Strength and Patience. So I wasn't necessarily trying to trick anybody, but I was definitely trying to build to a spot where that last line would have some kind of impact, if that makes sense.
Well, it had me screaming, so.
It was a wham moment, like, whoa, okay. Yeah, because I highlighted, like, yeah, this is something I need to remember.
Yeah, that's a highlight, underline the whole bit. Like, that was, and when I call it a trick, it's only in recognizing that trick actually made perfect sense once reflected upon. Because obviously, this story from the first moment is about strength and patience, and about the story that Strength and Patience is telling. And Aolo is really just a useful vehicle for Strength and Patience to be exploring this story. And I found that just absolutely I was not expecting, like, everybody's going to die, by the way, you just run.
She was inspired by Hamlet, so yeah.
Oh,
yeah, well, I mean, it had to end with corpses all over the stage, right? There was no question with that. But and in fact, I'll be honest, I meant to kill a Mother Zézumé, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was, because of course her analog is one of the corpses at the end of Hamlet. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't do it. But no, to the extent that I tricked the reader, one of the things that we're used to as readers is where the novel starts is what the reader assumes is going to be important.
Yes.
And I begin it with Aolo. And I begin it with the narrator thinking very hard about Aolo, like, who are you and why am I paying attention to you? And boy, you're interesting. I haven't seen you before. And so the reader comes away saying, well, this must be the main character of the book. Well, of course, he's a very super important character in the book. And there are lots of reasons for the narrator to be really sort of fascinated with and to a certain extent fond of Aolo. But he is, as you say, not actually the main character. So I guess I did kind of pull a bait and switch there.
You did, but it was a brilliant bait and switch, so we'll forgive you. And as you were just talking about, if one is looking at this as a stage, then Strength and Patience, you are almost led to believe that Strength and Patience is the audience of this stage. And when you discover that Strength and Patience the whole time was actually the scriptwriter.
The architect.
The architect of everything.
I mean, you do start off. I mean, we get to see stuff from Strength and Patience's point of view as he's explaining his backstory, and there is a point in the novel where you suddenly realize that maybe the Raven isn't quite what we thought it was, and then I started connecting out. So how do we get from there to there, and what does that mean? And then it all just falls very neatly into place. It's like, oh. So when you get the ending, it's like, okay, you close the trap. Yes, it makes sense what Strength and Patience has been doing all this time. Being an ancient elder god has its advantages.
Indeed, and having a lot of patience has its advantages, and Strength and Patience has patience in spades.
Yes. I just realized that one of the things that happens over the course is that this is clearly a novel about gods, but you actually I think we only meet 3 of them over the course of the novel. Other gods are spoken of, but we only meet the Myriad, Strength and Patience, and then the dog god whose name I'm not remembering right now.
Oisin.
Yes.
That would be Oisin.
And technically, we kind of, the Raven God isn't dead, so...
No, the Raven God we never actually meet, though.
Not exactly. You do sort of hear, kind of, from the Raven.
Oh, and also the Zula's God, the snake. We also meet that, too.
Ah, that's right. Okay, we do meet the snake. That's right. Okay, I apologize for that.
That's right. Well, and depending on, I'm trying to think I think I rewrote that scene. In the scene where there's an argument at the assembly about the raid that killed the people, I'm trying to remember the most recent version. There were actually a couple of gods giving testimony at that event. The fox with red eyes had actually had a speaking part in that scene, but that may be gone.
Yeah, I think, at least I'm not remembering it right now.
Yeah, I think the fox with red eyes got excised from that scene, which is a shame.
Yeah, because of the Ardvoskai gods, I think we just meet Oisin.
I think you're right.
Which I found fascinating as sort of the window through which, we're seeing all the rest of the gods. And again, that's another layer of where your narrator isn't exactly the most reliable person.
Yeah. Well, the narrator only has one way to manipulate what it says. It only has one way to manipulate how its listener understands what it says, and that's by leaving things out.
Right. Which Oisin clearly does when speaking to Strength and Patience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also available to Oisin, and Oisin absolutely makes use of that tactic, although Strength and Patience catches on to it pretty quickly. For Strength and Patience, who isn't very quick.
It just takes them a little while.
Yeah, they just gotta think about things for a couple years, that's all.
Exactly. I love that aspect of it. Okay, so I want to go back to Aolo real quick, because I loved him. He was wonderful.
Oh, good.
Obviously, you've made someone a name for yourself for exploring gender in your novels. So, obviously, Strength and Patience is an agender character. And then Aolo is transgender, which was awesome for me on a personal level. But I always find it interesting that in your narratives, you don't so much focus on their gender as it naturally arises in conversation. So it's both an issue and a non-issue. What makes you explore gender sort of in this fashion?
So that's a thing that ever since I started working on ancillary justice has really sort of intrigued me. The more that, because I began ancillary justice with a somewhat naive, very binarist idea about gender. And the more that I worked on those books, the more conversations I listened to, the more people talking about themselves and their experience of their own gender I listened to, the more I learned about the sort of how varied gender could really be. And so when it came time to write The Raven Tower, I knew, I don't know why, a lot of times writers will say, and often this is true, like, I don't know, that character just was 6 feet tall. I don't know, that character just was, I don't know why. Aola just was a trans man. I could not tell you why. It was just, there he was. That's who he was going to be. And I realized that I was going to have to be very careful not to step into a number of really kind of harmful and at best tiresome and at most harmful tropes for handling trans characters. But I also wanted to be sure that it wasn't a question of, I'm J.K. Rowling coming back going, oh, guess what? Aola was trans, right?
Arg.
I didn't want that to happen. I wanted it to be clear. I wanted it to be absolutely clear on the page that he was trans. But I didn't want to do it in any kind of a way that, the ways that a lot of cis writers often do, which is although I skirted this, but I didn't actually do it. There's some kind of an accident and he's unclothed and then the other characters see him and are shocked. Oh my gosh, look at your genitals. They're not what we thought they were. I'm like, I don't really care. And I don't think the reader should care what Aeola's genitals might be like. He doesn't need to be disrobed so that everybody can stare at him. But then I was like, how do I put that on the page? And so I actually spent a fair amount of time trying to make sure that I could put a character on the page who was trans, who wasn't just incidentally trans, as in it made no difference to his life. I put one sentence saying he's trans and then the rest of the book, like, why even would he have been? Because obviously there are going to be things where it's going to affect him. The specifics about his gender. And so I thought a long time about how to do that. And so I'm glad that it worked for you. I've been I did the best that I could, right? But I do think it's really super important to find some way to do that, to say, these are how people are in the world, and here they are. And this is kind of how it affects their life without making it into some kind of prurient show. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. You're not trying to put a stage play look at my trans character. Look.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. I just want to have my characters do what they're going to do in the story.
Speaking of which, in addition to Iolo being a trans character, you have a number of strong female characters, particularly Mother Zezume and Tikaz. And I was curious as to how you develop them, especially because Tikaz, I'm not mispronouncing her name, has a really interesting relationship with Iolo throughout the book. So I wanted you to explore that for us.
Oh, I really love Tikaz, I have to say. And a lot of her characters, let me put it this way, was very much a reaction to Ophelia's character. Ophelia is such a wet blanket. And when she's just always, yes, Dad, I'll do what you say. Yes, brother, I'll do what you say. Oh, my boyfriend's being mean to me, I'll cry. And then, oh, my boyfriend killed my dad, guess I'll die. She's not much of a character, and the actresses who've played her get the best that they can out of her, particularly the famous scene where she rants about, Rosemary, that's for remembrance, and you wear your rue with the difference, and they withered all when my father died, and all that stuff. You can get a lot of mileage out of that as an actress, but as a character, there's not a whole lot there. And I was like, no, that's not who I want. And so I began saying, I want a very different kind of character. But once she stepped on stage, she was very much doing what she wanted to do. I wasn't sure where her character was going to go. I just knew that her character was going to be very different from the way that Ophelia is usually portrayed. And she was very much one of those characters that I guess my subconscious had a definite plan for her.
Oh, definitely. She's definitely not, as you said, the wet blanket that Ophelia is. She's got motivations, actions, and empowerment, and is not to be messed with. She's rather fearsome.
No, and she's not going to touch Mawat with a 10-foot pole because she's not stupid, right?
I love that part. But at the same time, you let her get a lot of play out of being Ophelia for at least a period of time in the novel.
Oh, yes, she does. She does have her... She does the thing that Hamlet does and pretends to be out of her mind. Right? Oh, spoiler, I guess I should, but we already warned people about spoilers at the beginning. No, that was a lot of fun to write.
It was a fantastic twist that, though that Tikaz is obviously just a strong character and, definitely has her own mind about things, using that, the expectations that other people have of her was brilliantly done. Granted, Mawat to an extent does the same thing, which allows Aeolo to go about doing all his investigations because there is Mawat distracting everybody with his shenanigans.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess Mawat is not 100. I mean, he's fairly shrewd about what he's doing, but he also is maybe a little bit more self-involved.
Yes.
He's very focused on what he's supposed to have. Where what Tikaz is doing is, a little bit different. She's a little shrewder and a little more violent about what she's doing. Under similar provocation, isn't it? No, she was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed writing Tikaz. And Mother Zezume, she was also a character I enjoyed. One of the things, there are a number of places where I'm writing in direct response to sort of my thoughts about Hamlet, which is a play that a lot of us are very, very familiar with. I think almost everybody has read Hamlet at some point or another, in school, if nothing else. And Gertrude is another character who gets treated very badly. Hamlet treats her in a way you should never treat your own mother in a million years. And he's all, oh, look at this, you've betrayed me and I'm supposed to be on the throne and, look at you cheating on my father. It's incest, which I don't even know how that's incest, but okay. And the fact of the matter is, Zezume's point is one that I think Gertrude could make, which is, here's your uncle deciding he wants to be king. Here are you on your way home from college. Your uncle is desperate enough to have maybe murdered your father. Your mother is going to defy him, refuse to marry him. What do you think's going to happen next? There's going to be a dead prince and a dead queen.
Buy a clue, Hamlet.
Yeah, buy a clue, Hamlet. It's entirely possible that Gertrude saved his ungrateful life.
And given that the ways that women are allowed to wield power, marriage is one of the few
ways to do that. Yeah. It's a temporary setback for Hamlet, but being killed by his uncle would be a far more permanent setback. I was also really interested in so one of Shakespeare's sources, or one of the ultimate sources for the Hamlet story, is Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote a big sort of history of Scandinavia kind of thing, history of Denmark. And the Hamlet story, the original of it, comes from there. And in that particular story, we do have Hamlet whose father has been murdered by a man who then marries Hamlet's mother. And in this case, everybody knows that the second husband murdered Hamlet's father. Everybody knows it. But the murderer says that he did it because Hamlet's father was abusive to Hamlet's mother. Okay? So Hamlet does the whole pretending to be insane thing for years and years and years, and finally then has the confrontation scene with his mother, upbraids her, and then kills the second husband and all of the second husband's retainers and friends and such. And I said, the interesting thing about this, you know what's really interesting about this, is nobody ever asks Hamlet's mother whether or not that's true. Hamlet just says, oh, that's not true. He's making it up because he's a murderer. And nobody ever asks Hamlet's mother. She never has a word to say in this story. And I found that really, really interesting. And I was thinking about that as I was thinking about Zezume as a character who is not married to the Lys ever at any point. But thinking about the way that Hamlet just assumes what her motivations are, without stopping to say, oh, maybe I'll talk to Mother Zezume about this. Just assumes. And what kind of a person Hamlet's father might have actually been, and what kind of a person Hamlet might have actually been, worshipping his father as much as he does in the play Hamlet. Now, I don't think Shakespeare put that in there as subtext. In fact, I'm quite sure it never occurred to Shakespeare to put that in there as subtext. Perhaps I'm doing Shakespeare an injustice, but I don't think so. But it was certainly something that went into how I thought about Zezume and the way that she related to Mawat and the way she related to Mawat's father.
And now I'm thinking about Hamlet in a slightly different direction than I was before. It's been a while since I've read it, so you'll have to.
Yeah, well, I have read it far more recently for probably obvious reasons.
Do you have a favorite movie or play adaptation of Hamlet?
I don't really. The first one I ever actually saw was Derek Jacobi. In fact, that was the first time I ever saw Derek Jacobi. I was in high school, and it was on PBS. And I enjoyed it a lot, and then I had to read it for school. I've seen a number of Hamlets, and they've all been different and interesting and good, but I don't know if any of them really felt to me like the perfect Hamlet.
Okay, that's fair. Jumping topics slightly, you did mention earlier before the Arabian's Lease, and I'm always interested, as you know, in world building and magic systems and whatnot. So I was curious, when I was reading the novel and reading how the the Raven's Lease are supposed to work, at least in theoretically, although we find out that things are really not actually working the way people think they are. It felt kind of like a Year King sort of golden bough sort of approach. I was curious if you could unlock for us how you came up with the idea of the Raven's Lease and how they're tied with the Raven God, and how you came up with that whole system of when one dies, the other dies, and the succession of that, and how that drives the whole plot, the whole Hamlet-like plot of the novel.
So I actually lifted that pretty directly from Death and the King's Horseman, which is a play about a historical event that happened 100 or so years ago in Nigeria, when the king of the group that this was, I think it's the Yoruba. I may have the group wrong, because there's a reason I did not try and make this an African fantasy. I do not have that kind of deep knowledge, but the play is really neat, and I would urge anybody listening to give it a read. So when the king of this group dies, his horseman, that's an inherited office, voluntarily dies a certain number of days afterwards to accompany him to the afterlife. And it's really important that he do this, because if he doesn't do this, the king himself won't get safely to the afterlife. And by this time, the British are in Nigeria, and they hear that this is happening, and they interfere. They prevent him from dying, causing a huge problem for the whole area. But he has a son who's been modern educated. He's coming back from school. The son is, because he's heard that the king has died. And so he knows he has to come home because his father is going to die soon. And so he's involved. And those were the things that I went, oh, okay, I can slot that into my memory of Hamlet. Those are really interesting correspondences. But it mostly shows up in the Raven Tower as when the god dies, the lease has to die. And of course, in the plot of Hamlet, the scandal is that the king has died improperly. And in Death and the King's Horseman, the scandal is that the horseman has failed to die properly, as he should have. And so I just kind of reversed that. But I had to do a sort of a golden bough type Year King sort of thing to make that work, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to weld those two together, sure.
So your answer just led me to thinking about, and I'm awful with names from books, unfortunately, but the Tell and the goddess, because I just realized there is another god that we meet, and that's the goddess.
Oh, that's Stalker.
Yes, Stalker. Oh, love the name, for one thing. And the fact that that's how the Iridan defeat the Tell in that one battle, is by preventing the sacrifice.
By preventing the sacrifice. Yeah.
Very interesting. So you're kind of doing both sides of it. The side that is going to, for the Iridan at least, makes it very difficult for them to continue, their structure, government structure, but also allows them to defeat a different people.
Yeah. Although to a certain extent, that scene is there. I actually added that fairly late, because my editors they found it difficult to sympathize with characters who were so urgent about particular people dying. So when they come across Mawat's father underneath the tower, and Mawat just wants to turn and leave him, and my editor said, "Oh, I really don't like this. Right? How can he just leave him? How can he just leave him there and be so angry with him?" And I'm like, well, but this is a society where if you promise to sacrifice yourself, you have to sacrifice yourself. And so I added that in, and then that gave me I added in the business with Stalker, but that gave me that nice parallel, which is the thing that, as you say, allows them to undo the Tell or prevent the Tell, at least for a while, is also the thing. It's the same technique that's going to hurt them. But it also allowed me to show that in this particular culture, that was serious business, right? You didn't say you were going to do this and then not do it.
Very serious business, judging from Mawat's reaction to his father not succeeding in killing himself, despite the pool of water directly in front of him.
And Moat insisting for so long that no, my father could not have run away. No, never. Eventually, basically having to have his nose rubbed into the truth by YOLO. So,
yeah, he really didn't like that, did he? Yeah.
No, he did not.
Moat does not strike me as the type of person that likes to be proven wrong at any point in time.
Oh no, he does not. He's a character with a lot of good qualities, but those are balanced by a lot of not good qualities.
Indeed. One of the final tricks that you pull on us is that it turns out Strength and Patience actually is kind of into blood sacrifices. So how did you sort of develop the system by which your gods are receiving power?
So that's an interesting question. That was a thing that I developed by feel as I was writing the short stories. What I didn't want to do was the thing that's actually, I think, fairly common, which is that in a lot of fantasies, a lot of good fantasies use it. The more people believe in a god, the more powerful a god is. And I didn't want that. I wanted something a little more mechanical. So I said, well, there have to be specific actions that people take. So prayers, sacrifices, various rituals are going to do the trick. And that led me to think, well, how does that work? And so I've settled on an answer in my own mind, but I don't think I'll go into it here for various reasons. But once I had decided what that mechanism was, then I knew what would give power to the gods. But the most obvious manifestation of it is that things like a prayer will give a little bit of power. An offering of water or milk or wine will give a little more. But the ultimate concentrated, powerful sacrifice is a voluntary human sacrifice. That's sort of the top level of what you can get out of a human being. And obviously that's extremely important in this story. And as you say, Strength and Patience doesn't normally care about how much sacrifice it gets. Strength and Patience is happy to get whatever comes its way, but is also maybe not terribly generous with giving out favors either, at least not until it's thought about them for a couple of years. And so it does, I guess, come as kind of a surprise at the end when you realize that Strength and Patience has been maneuvering all this time to get itself a nice, juicy blood sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Surprise is one way to put it.
It's jaw-dropping. It's a nice, sedate stone god has been pulling strings and very slowly, patiently working towards us. I mean, we for a lot of this, we have Strength and Patience talking with the myriad about how sacrifices work or shouldn't work, and it's a very, very slow build towards finally revealing what Strength and Patience has been doing for quite a while to get things.
Yeah, it's been sitting there going a little closer, a little closer, a little closer. Yeah, now a little closer, right? Yeah, until everybody steps where it wants him, right?
Well, Strength and Patience has the benefit of eons, I suppose one could say.
Yes.
So, I am curious, given the ending, what is Strength and Patience's next move?
Oh, Strength and Patience's next move is going to be to sit there and wait until the myriad arrives. Because once, see, this is one of the, every now and then I'll see somebody say, oh, there's going to be a sequel, right? I'm like, well, no, what do you think is going to happen after the end of that book? Strength and Patience is going to speak the tower down, speak that snake dead, and possibly be unconscious after that. And so it's going to wait for the myriad to come dig it out.
Right. And then I believe at one point it says that it's the only thing it wants to do is get back to its hill.
Yep. It just wants to go home.
It seemed to me that statement was one of the really only firm statements that Strength and Patience even makes, aside from not accidentally, very purposefully, but not necessarily realizing the consequences of said words, speaking themselves into a God-spoken object, which I think was one of the most fascinating things to happen given who Strength and Patience is. The fact that they would even allow a mistake to happen.
Long-term strategies.
A mistake of that magnitude. It's a pretty big mistake. At the same time, I think that strength and patience real, it can't just go home. It can't just up and go home the way that the Myriad can, and the way that a lot of the other gods that have come down to participate in the war could go home. It's sort of stuck, and it sort of has to put everything it can into the war effort to increase its chances of getting home. Also, strength and patience is leaving a lot out of its narrative, and it talks a good game about not being that super strong and not really knowing what's going on, but strength and patience has known for a while that it's a lot stronger than everybody thinks it is. So strength and patience has a certain amount of arrogance going into that deal, right? Even though it's being extremely cautious, it's already decided, I think, that it's much stronger than many of the gods that are currently in Ardvostia. And it may well be right about that. But of course, it will never say that, because what if it's wrong?
Right, going back to that fascinating magic system, to speak a non-truth changes reality, and it could kill you to change that reality.
It sure could. It could be, if you say an impossible thing, it could kill you in the attempt to change the reality, but you never can, right?
Right.
I mean, imagine a god trying to say everything I say is a lie.
Epimy's paradox. Oh no.
Right? It wouldn't work. It would be very, very bad.
For just the god or for everybody?
Well, for the god, certainly.
So you've written short fiction in this world. So how does this novel tie in temporarily or otherwise, or character or otherwise, with those stories that you've written?
So it doesn't tie in very firmly. There are in the very beginning of the novel, the narrator, Strength and Patience, mentions the name of a city, Therete, which is the setting for one of the short stories. But all the short stories are set on an entirely different continent. So they don't tie in. In the short stories, there's characters are named, gods are named, geographical areas are named, so that they kind of tie in. But this particular novel takes place very physically far away from those other short stories, and I honestly don't know where they tie in time-wise, because I didn't need to, because it was so very far away from the other locations. So I honestly don't know for sure, but I did make sure to at least tie it in a little bit at the very beginning, in that list of cities where silk might have come from and that sort of thing is a location where one of the short stories is set.
Aha, very cool. A little bit of an Easter egg, good.
Yes.
Easter eggs are always fun, especially the chocolate-filled ones.
Oh, yes.
So I have one final question before we actually do our final question. And that is, if there was one thing about the Raven Tower that you wish your readers knew or thought about while reading or looking back upon, what would that one thing be?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure. I guess from the number of people who have asked whether there's going to be a sequel, I would like everyone to realize that it's a standalone. But I'm not sure. I certainly hope that readers enjoy it and get something out of it that is either meaningful or positive out of it. But I'm not sure there's something that I want every reader to bear in mind while reading, or to know or think while reading it.
Excellent answer. And with that, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and the Raven Tower and all the rest of your work?
So the Raven Tower and all my other books, pretty much anywhere they sell books, you can get them. Pretty much anywhere they sell ebooks, you can get the Raven Tower. I don't have any appearances coming up, but I have my website at AnneLeckie.com, and I'm on Twitter as Ann_Leckie, and I'm on Tumblr as Anne Leckie, no spaces or underscores or anything. So you can always find me there.
Awesome sauce.
Yep, thank you so much for being with us tonight, Anne Leckie. It's a pleasure to talk to you again after so long.
You know, it has been too long. This has been lovely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Excellent. And listeners, if you'd like to drop us a line, you can do so through email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com or Twitter at skiffyandfanty. You can also sign up for our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com, that newsletter. And if you want to support us, you can support us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty, so you can support more excellent conversations like we had tonight with Anne Leckie. So thank you once again, Anne.
Thank you.
Stay frosty, listeners.
If you would like to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty or find us on Twitter @SkiffyandFanty, our webpage skiffyandfanty.com, or you can even send us an email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The intro music for this podcast was taken from Rock Thing by Creo. You can find out more about their music on freemusicarchive.org.